I didn't see the darkness, I felt it. The palace walls crumbled around me. The wind howled like a ghost through the empty corridors. This ruined place was my sentence, the last refuge for a blind widow and her starving grandchildren. But amidst the despair, when my fingers touched that cold crack in the stone, a shiver ran down my spine and a voice whispered in my mind. There was a secret, and what I was about to discover in my blindness would change everyone's destiny forever. Ilara felt the cold stone beneath her fingers, an almost invisible crack that seemed to vibrate with an ancient and mysterious energy. The shiver that ran down her spine was not of fear, but of a strange and powerful anticipation that drew her closer, a silent call. Her grandchildren, little Lyra and frail Tomei, slept restlessly in a nearby corner, their stomachs rumbling softly. Their hunger was a constant whip, driving Ilara to seek any trace of hope in that forgotten place. She knew she couldn't rest, not while her grandchildren's lives depended on her persistence. With her fingertips, Ilara began to map the wall with infinite patience. Every inch of the cold, uneven stone was explored with a delicacy that only the deprivation of sight could hone. The smell of mold and ancient dust was dense, but she perceived nuances, a touch of more recent dampness, an almost imperceptible scent of aged wood. She knelt, feeling the stone floor beneath her aching knees, and followed the crack that had caught her attention. It was thin, persistent, like a vein pulsing beneath the skin of the ancient palace. The murmur she had heard before, almost inaudible, now seemed closer, more insistent. They weren't words, but an echo, as if the palace itself was sighing secrets kept for centuries. Ilara moved her hand, following her keen intuition. Her fingers brushed against something soft and rough, a torn tapestry, precariously hanging. She pulled it carefully, and the old fabric gave way with a muffled sound, revealing an empty space behind. Ilara's heart leapt in her chest, a strong, hopeful beat. A secret passage opened before her. The darkness there was even deeper, a blackness that seemed to absorb any trace of light or hope. But Ilara was not intimidated. The need to protect Lyra and Tomei was a beacon stronger than any shadow, a force that propelled her. She cautiously extended her hand, feeling the dense, still air. The space was narrow, claustrophobic, and the smell of damp earth and rusted metal intensified. She took a step forward, feeling the ground with her foot, making sure it was safe. The murmur guided her through the darkness. Her fingers continued to explore, sliding along the cold, damp stone. Then they touched something hard and cold. It wasn't the wall. It was a smooth yet irregular surface, with protrusions and indentations. She followed the contour, and the shape revealed itself unmistakably. A box. An iron box, heavy and covered with a thick layer of rust that flaked off under her touch. A tremor ran through Ilara. Could it be? After so many years of despair, was fortune finally smiling upon her? Hope, an almost forgotten feeling, began to blossom in her chest. She knelt, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to lift the box. It was heavier than it looked, a weight that carried not only the metal, but the past, the secrets, and perhaps the future of her small family. With considerable effort, Ilara managed to drag the box out of the narrow passage into the slightly more open area where her grandchildren slept. The sound of metal dragging on the stone floor echoed, but the children did not wake. Ilara sat on the cold floor, the iron box between her legs. Her fingers traced the grooves and latches, feeling the resistance of the rust, the promise of a secret. The anxiety was almost unbearable. What would be inside? Gold coins for her grandchildren, or just another disappointment? She took a deep breath. The truth was just one effort away from being revealed. The iron box, cold and heavy, rested between Ilara's legs, an enigma sealed by rust and time. Her fingers, calloused by life and sharpened by blindness, fumbled with the latches, feeling the stubborn resistance of the corroded metal. A sigh escaped her lips, laden with a mix of exhaustion and an almost painful hope. She could not fail. Lyra and Tomei depended on her, their small, fragile bodies, their empty bellies. Their image, even in the darkness of her mind, was a beacon that propelled her. With concentrated effort, Elara forced the latches. The metal creaked, a harsh sound that echoed in the palace's silence, but the children continued to sleep, exhausted. She felt the rust crumble under her fingers, a reddish powder that clung to her skin. The first latch gave way with a dry snap, and a wave of relief, mixed with a new surge of anxiety, filled her chest. The second latch was more stubborn, requiring Elara to use all the strength she had left. Her muscles trembled, but finally, with a muffled groan from the metal, it released. The scent that rose from the box was not that of gold or jewels, but an unmistakable aroma of old paper, ink, and long-kept secrets. Elara carefully opened the lid, feeling the rusted hinge protest. Her hands plunged inside, and her fingertips touched something soft and dry. It wasn't the cold gleam of precious metal, nor the smooth contour of cut stones. It was paper. A pang of disappointment hit her, swift and cruel, but it was soon replaced by a deeper curiosity. With delicacy, she removed the first item. It was a roll of parchments tied with a thin cord that crumbled in her hands. The rough texture of the material, the way it unrolled, all indicated its antiquity. Next, her fingers found a more compact rectangular object. A book. No. A diary, she realized, feeling the dried leather cover and the thin, fragile pages. Elara's heart began to beat faster. Parchments and a diary. Perhaps it wasn't gold, but it could be something far more valuable. She picked up the diary first, feeling the weight of history in her hands. Her fingers traced the cover, the marks of time, the grooves that were once ornaments. Carefully, she opened the first page. She couldn't see the words, but she could feel the texture of the dry ink, the way it slightly rose from the paper. It was as if the letters whispered stories in her mind, and indeed, as she ran her fingers over the first lines, a strange sensation invaded her. A cold truth, like the palace stone, began to unfold. The parchments and the diary spoke of numbers, transactions, debts. But more than that, they spoke of manipulation, of deceit. Her deceased husband's debt, the one that had led them to ruin and expulsion from their home, was not real. It was a web of lies, cunningly forged to strip her family of everything. A righteous and cold anger began to bubble in Elara's chest, a force she hadn't felt in years. Her beloved husband, whose name had been tarnished, was innocent. And she, the blind widow, held the proof in her hands. But the revelation didn't stop there. The diary, with its yellowed pages, mentioned a treasure, an ancestral treasure, hidden by the ancient kings of the palace, destined to be discovered by someone with a pure heart. The phrase echoed in Elara's mind, bringing with it a new wave of hope, more vibrant and powerful than any she had ever felt. It wasn't just her husband's innocence that was at stake, but the future of Lyra and Tomei. True vision, she realized, was not in the eyes but in the soul. And hope, like a rare flower, bloomed in the deepest darkness. Elara felt the rough parchment and the aged diary in her hands, the weight of the newly discovered truth crushing her and, at the same time, uplifting her. The forged debt, the cruelty that had destroyed her life and that of her beloved husband, now revealed itself as a blatant lie. A wave of indignation ran through her tired body, transforming into cold determination. Her husband was not a dishonored debtor. He had been the victim of a vile plot, and Elara, the blind widow, had the proof. She clenched her fists, feeling the tension, the silent promise that she would fight for the honor of her love and the future of her family. Justice, once dead, now beckoned. She could not see Lyra's innocent smile or Tomei's fragile sweetness, but their hungry image was a fire burning in her chest, a promise never to give up. She ran her fingers over the diary pages, seeking more than just confirmation of the fraud. There was a mention of a treasure, a legacy of the ancient kings, kept for someone with a pure heart. What did pure heart mean? Ilara pondered, her brow furrowed as the smell of mold and old paper filled her nostrils. It would be a test of character, of altruism, a virtue driven by unconditional love for her grandchildren. Her fingers traced the parchments, feeling the folds and the raised dry ink. They were not just words, but maps, symbols, perhaps complex enigmas that required a new vision. Every line, every drawing was an invitation to a journey, a challenge that she, the blind widow, was willing to accept with all her soul. The palace, once a labyrinth of shadows and despair, began to transform in her mind. It was no longer a tomb, but a living map, full of secrets waiting to be unveiled. Ilara imagined the cold walls, the echoing corridors, the towers, not as obstacles but as clues, pieces of a giant puzzle. She would need infinite patience, her keen hearing for the slightest creaks, her sensitive touch for every texture, every sense that darkness had honed. The wind howling through the corridors now seemed to carry not the lament of ghosts, but the whispers of a forgotten story, waiting to be retold by her hands and her heart. A plan was essential. She needed to understand the documents. Without sight, she would memorize the texture of each parchment, the order of the diary pages, the sensations they evoked, building a slow and meticulous mental map of the place. It was slow, meticulous work. The urgency of Lyra and Tomei's hunger was a relentless clock. She leaned over the box, her fingers exploring every corner, searching for any other clue. Hope, once a tenuous thread, was now a vibrant flame, warming her spirit and lighting the way. Morning was approaching, and with it, the awakening of her grandchildren. Ilara had no immediate answers for their hunger, but now she had a promise: justice for her husband, redemption for her family, and a future. She put the documents back in the iron box, feeling the weight of responsibility and the lightness of a new and unwavering determination. The palace, with its secrets and ruins, would be the stage for her greatest struggle, and she, the blind widow, was ready to face every challenge, guided by faith and unwavering love. Morning arrived, not with a vibrant sun, but with a pale, cold light that barely penetrated the cracks of the ruined palace. Ilara, exhausted but with her mind buzzing, felt the first weak rays touch her face. The most urgent sound, however, was not the wind, but Lyra's low moan and Tomei's faint cry. She turned to them, her heart heavy. Her grandchildren were waking, and the hunger, which she felt in her own empty stomach, would be even crueler for them. She approached the little ones, feeling the floor until she found Lyra. The girl was feverish, her breath wheezing, and Tomei coughed softly, a sound that tore at Ilara's soul. "Grandma," Lyra whispered, her voice weak, and her tiny hand sought hers. Ilara held it tenderly, feeling the heat of the fever. "I'm here, my angel. Grandma is here." She had no food, not at that moment, but she had a promise, a secret kept in the iron box that could change everything. The urgency was palpable. She needed food and some medicine for her grandchildren, but she also needed to unravel the mysteries of the parchments and the diary. How to reconcile these two pressing needs? Ilara's mind, sharpened by the deprivation of sight, began to devise a plan. First, she needed fresh water. Guided by the memory of the palace, she stood up, her knees aching, and promised herself that she would find a spring or a well, something that could relieve the little one's thirst and fever. With her grandchildren once again asleep in their corner, Ilara returned to the iron box. The faint morning light was useless to her eyes, but her fingers were her eyes. With almost supernatural concentration, she began to explore the parchments. Every fold, every tear, Every texture of the dry ink was a map for her mind. She felt the difference between the characters, the density of the paper in certain areas, the marks of dampness that indicated the passage of time. It was a slow, painful process, but she could not give up. She started with the diary, as the words written in prose seemed more accessible to her tactile interpretation. Her fingers traced the lines, feeling the raised ink. She memorized the sequence of letters, the shapes, and tried to connect the patterns. It was like learning a new language through touch. The first pages confirmed the fraud against her husband, detailing names and dates, but in a veiled, almost coded way. Ilara felt the anger bubble up, but she transformed it into fuel for her search. Then she reached the pages that spoke of the treasure. They were not just words, but drawings, symbols engraved with a precision she could feel. They were maps, she realized, but not ordinary maps. They were enigmas, with references to specific points in the palace, to constellations, and to secret passages she had not yet discovered. With each new touch, a piece of the puzzle fit into her mind. The palace, once a labyrinth of darkness, now revealed itself as a map of hope, waiting to be unveiled. She smelled the mold on the parchments, an aroma that, paradoxically, carried with it the promise of a future. Ilara knew the journey would be long, that each day would be a battle against hunger, illness, and despair. But with the truth in her hands and love for Lyra and Tomei in her heart, she was ready. She couldn't see the way, but she felt that justice and redemption were waiting for her, hidden somewhere in the depths of that ancient palace. Ilara felt the weight of the parchments on her lap, the rough texture of truth and enigmas beneath her fingers. Morning advanced, and with it, the urgency of Lyra and Tomei's hunger and illness intensified. She could hear Lyra's gasping breath, Tomei's dry cough, and every sound was a whip to her soul, driving her to decipher the palace's secrets. With the patience that only darkness could hone, Ilara continued to explore the diary. Her fingers traced the lines, feeling the raised ink, memorizing the sequence of symbols and the strange, repeating shapes. She had understood the fraud, the web of lies that had dishonored her husband, and this righteous anger fueled her. But the treasure maps were another story. They were complex, intricate drawings that seemed to defy her tactile perception. There was one particular symbol, a series of curves and dots that connected illogically to her fingers. She tried and retried, but the mental image wouldn't form. It was as if the key to that specific enigma required a vision she didn't possess, a perspective that the darkness of her eyes couldn't reach. A pang of despair threatened to invade her chest. How could she, blind, unravel something that seemed made to be seen? She pressed her lips together, her brow furrowed in concentration as her fingers stubbornly traced the lines of the parchment. Time was precious, and with each passing minute her grandchildren's hunger grew crueler. Ilara sighed, a heavy sound that was lost in the palace's silence. She leaned close to Lyra, who coughed softly, her body feverish. With a trembling hand, Ilara caressed the girl's forehead, feeling the worrying heat. "My little one, my brave Lyra," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. As Ilara comforted her, Lyra, in her feverish delirium, moved her tiny hand. It wasn't a conscious gesture, but the innocence of her touch still carried a force. Lyra's hand, small and warm, slid across Ilara's palm, and then, with an almost imperceptible movement, the girl began to trace something. They weren't words, but a simple, repetitive shape, as if drawing in the air. Ilara felt the movement in her palm, the light pressure of the child's fingers. It was a series of arches, linking to each other, forming a kind of chain. Ilara's heart leaped. That shape. She had felt it on the parchments. It wasn't a complex drawing, but the representation of something simple, of a link, of a connection. Suddenly, Ilara's mind lit up. The symbol that had frustrated her was not a static image, but a sequence, a movement. Lyra, unknowingly, had given her the key. That symbol represented not an object, but a passage, a path that revealed itself step by step, like a chain of links. True vision, she realized, was not in the eyes, but in the ability to feel, to connect, to interpret the world in a different way. It was the intuition, the innocence, the pure heart of her granddaughter that had unraveled the most difficult enigma. A wave of gratitude and hope invaded Ilara, warming her from the inside out. She couldn't see Lyra's smile, but she felt the strength of her spirit. The palace was not just a map of secrets, but a mirror of life, where answers came from the most unexpected places, often from simplicity and love. Ilara squeezed Lyra's hand, a silent promise that she would not give up. The path would be long, but now she had a new perspective, a new vision, guided by unwavering love for her grandchildren. She was no longer alone in the darkness. Ilara squeezed Lyra's hand, a silent promise that she would not give up. The path would be long, but now she had a new perspective, a new vision, guided by unwavering love for her grandchildren. She was no longer alone in the darkness. That innocent touch from Lyra had been the key, a beacon in the fog of indecipherable symbols. What once seemed like a random sequence of curves on the parchment now revealed itself as a trail, a chain of steps, one link leading to the next. Ilara felt a shiver of understanding run down her spine. The treasure was not marked by an X on a map, but by a journey, a path that demanded more than eyes. It demanded the soul and purity of heart. With renewed energy, Ilara turned to the parchments, her fingers dancing over the rough surface. She no longer sought a static image, but the sensation of movement, of progression. And there it was, in the sequence of arches that Lyra had traced on her palm, the representation of a spiral staircase, of a winding corridor, of a passage that folded back on itself. She could feel the raised ink, the way one arch connected to another, forming an uninterrupted chain. It was as if the palace, with its cold walls and ancient stones, was whispering its secrets directly into her hands. With each touch, a piece of the puzzle fit into place. The diary mentioned the serpent's heart, a phrase that once seemed poetic and meaningless. Now, Ilara realized it referred to the winding shape of one of the internal staircases, perhaps the main one. Her fingers traced the drawings on the parchments, following the serpent that coiled, leading to a specific point. This point, she realized, was a niche in the wall, described with a tactile detail, a different, smoother texture with a slight indentation. Lyra and Tomei's hunger and fever were a constant weight, an urgency that propelled Ilara. She knew she couldn't afford to waste time. She needed to act. With the parchments carefully stored in the iron box, she stood up, her muscles aching, but her spirit alight. Her grandchildren still slept, their fragile bodies a constant reminder of the battle she faced. Guided by the new understanding of the map and the tactile memory of the palace, Ilara began to move. She had already explored the main corridors, but now her search was more focused. She looked for specific textures, for unevenness, for that serpent that the diary and parchments had revealed. Every step was cautious, her feet feeling the irregularities of the floor, her ears attentive to any echo that might indicate a passage. She remembered a wider corridor near the main entrance, where the wind whistled in a peculiar way. There, she had felt a wall with a slightly different texture, smoother than the rough stones around it. It was a place she had dismissed before, having found no obvious door. But what if the serpent led to something less evident? Ilara extended her hands, sliding them along the cold wall. Her fingers traced the stones, feeling every groove, every imperfection. Then she found it, the smooth texture, the subtle indentation. It wasn't a door, but a section of the wall that seemed movable. She pushed, fumbled, searching for a mechanism. The palace, with its secrets, seemed to want to test her persistence. A small, almost inaudible noise caught her attention. It didn't come from the wall, but from above. A creak, like that of an old hinge, and a faint breath of cold air. Ilara raised her hand, feeling the air. The passage was not in the wall, but above it. A trapdoor, perhaps. Ilara's heart pounded, hope vibrating in every fiber of her being. She was no longer just deciphering a map, she was living it, feeling every pulsation of its mystery, and with each step, the promise of a future for Lyra and Tomei became more real. With each step, the promise of a future for Lyra and Tomei became more real. Ilara felt the cold air blowing from above, confirming her intuition. There was a trapdoor. Her fingers traced the smooth wall, searching for a foothold, a crack, anything that would help her reach what was above. The height was a challenge, and her blindness transformed every movement into an act of faith. She couldn't see, but she could feel the urgency in her chest, the echo of Lyra's hunger and Tomei's cough in her ears. Cautiously, Ilara began to explore the higher wall, stretching as far as she could. Her fingers brushed against a protrusion, a slightly loose stone that seemed to have been carved to serve as a foothold. It was precarious, but it was all she had. With a sigh of determination, she pushed herself up, leaning on the stone and feeling the space above. The trapdoor's wood was old, creaking under her fingertips. There was a small iron handle, rusted and almost imperceptible, which she managed to grasp. Ilara pulled with all the strength her tired arms could muster. The wood groaned, letting out a sharp squeal that echoed through the corridor. For a moment she feared everything would collapse on her. But then, with a dry snap, the trapdoor gave way, opening upwards. A gust of damp, musty air, laden with the smell of earth and ancient stone, enveloped her. The sound of something lightly falling on the dirt floor above indicated that the way was clear. With the trapdoor open, Ilara realized there was no ladder. The passage was a dark, narrow hole, which would require her to crawl upwards. It would be a challenge for anyone, but for a blind, elderly woman it seemed almost impossible. However, the image of Lyra, the girl with her fever, and Tomei, the boy with his persistent cough, was an engine in her heart. She could not fail. She stepped back a little to assess the situation. Her fingers traced the edge of the hole, feeling the roughness of the wood and the coldness of the stone. There was a small indentation in the wall just below the trapdoor, which could serve as a foothold. With this small advantage, Ilara decided to try. She crouched down, placed one hand on the wall, and with tremendous effort managed to push herself up, placing her foot in the indentation. Slowly, with her other hand seeking support on the edge of the trapdoor, she began to hoist herself up. Every muscle protested, every joint ached, but she persisted. Sweat ran down her forehead, and her breathing became ragged. Finally, with a last push, she managed to get her body through the hole. She fell to her knees on a damp dirt floor, the smell of mold even stronger. She was in a narrow corridor, another secret passage, completely dark. Her fingers traced the ground, feeling the soft earth beneath her palms. There was a slight slope, indicating that the passage descended. Ilara paused, taking a deep breath, trying to calm her wildly beating heart. She felt adrenaline and exhaustion mixing. Before moving on, she needed to make sure Lyra and Tomei were all right. She turned, feeling her way back to the trapdoor opening. With a soft voice, she called, "Lyra, Tomei, are you all right, my angels?" There was no immediate answer, just the palace's silence and the echo of her own voice. She waited, attentive, and heard the soft, regular breathing of her grandchildren still asleep in their corner. A wave of relief washed over her body. They were safe, for now. With a calmer heart, Ilara turned to the darkness of the new passage. The adventure was just beginning, and she, The blind widow was ready to unravel every secret, guided by faith and unwavering love for her grandchildren. She didn't know what she would find, but hope was a beacon in her darkness. Ilara advanced through the damp darkness, her fingers extended, feeling the cold stone walls. The corridor was narrow, forcing her to walk sideways in some sections, and the floor, covered with a layer of soft earth and debris, made each step uncertain. The smell of mold and wet earth was intense, mixing with an almost imperceptible metallic aroma, which Ilara associated with time and abandonment. She could feel the low ceiling brushing her hair at some points, and claustrophobia threatened to tighten her chest, an ancient fear mixed with worry. But the image of Lyra, the girl with her fever, and Tomei, the boy with his cough, was a shield against fear, a constant reminder of her mission and the promise she had made to herself. The passage seemed endless, and the darkness was so dense she felt as if she could touch it. Her ears, however, were sharp, catching the distant drip of water, the rustle of something small moving in the shadows, perhaps a hungry rat. She tried to ignore these sounds, focusing on any change in the wall's texture or the floor's slope. With every meter, hope mingled with exhaustion. Her knees ached, and the hunger in her stomach was a tight knot, but her determination was stronger. Suddenly, the wall to her right changed. It ceased to be cold, irregular stone, and became something smoother, almost polished, with a slight curve. Ilara stopped, her fingers exploring the surface with care and curiosity. It wasn't stone, nor wood. It was metal or something similar, covered by a thin layer of dust and rust that stained her fingers. She followed the curvature, realizing that the passage widened slightly and that the smooth wall formed an intentionally created indentation. With her heart beating faster, Ilara felt the niche. It was a small chamber, not very deep, but enough for her to enter and turn around. In the center, her fingers found a flat, cold surface. It was a stone table, covered by a thin layer of dust that crumbled to the touch. And on it, something more, an object. It was small, cylindrical, and her fingers felt the grooves of an ancient material, perhaps bronze or copper corroded by time, but still resistant. Ilara picked it up, feeling its weight in her hand, a weight that carried centuries of history. It wasn't a jewel, nor gold, but something that seemed to have been made for a very specific purpose. She turned it, exploring every detail with her fingertips. There were engraved symbols, similar to those she had felt on the parchments, but sharper, deeper, as if they had been made to be deciphered by touch. One of the symbols was the chain of arches that Lyra had traced on her palm, the link that revealed the winding staircase. But there was more. There was a drawing of a star, and next to it, a small indentation, a tiny hole that her fingers could barely feel, but which seemed to be the exact measure of something. Ilara pondered, her mind working feverishly, connecting the invisible dots. Could it be a key, a piece of a complex mechanism? She sat on the damp floor of the small chamber, holding the precious object with reverence. Hope, once a distant beacon, now shone with greater intensity, almost eclipsing the darkness around her. This object was not the treasure itself, she knew, but it was undeniable proof that she was on the right path. It was a vital piece of the puzzle, perhaps the key to the next door, or the next secret. The exhaustion was immense, but the discovery propelled her with renewed energy. She needed to go back to the parchments, compare the symbols, understand the exact purpose of that object and how it fit into the grand tapestry of the treasure. Her grandchildren upstairs still depended on her, and with each new clue, the promise of a future became more tangible, more real. She was not just seeking riches, but redemption, justice for her husband, and the salvation of her family from misery. The palace, with its secrets and ruins, continued to unfold before her, revealing that true vision resided in the persistence of spirit, in intuition, and in the purity of love. Ilara, with the cylindrical object firmly in her hands, felt the weight of the discovery and the urgency of time. The exhaustion was immense, but the adrenaline of hope propelled her. She knew she needed to return to Lyra and Tomei, to the faint light filtering from the trapdoor opening, where the parchments and diary awaited her to unravel the next step. Rising from the damp floor of that small chamber was an effort. Her knees protested, and the stiffness in her muscles was a constant reminder of her age and the trials she faced. Cautiously, she felt her way back through the narrow corridor, her fingers sliding along the smooth metal wall, and then the cold, irregular stone. Every step was measured, every sound an alert. The smell of mold and earth was still strong, but now she felt a faint breath of fresh air coming from the direction of the trapdoor, a promise of return. The climb back up through the trapdoor hole seemed even harder than the descent. Ilara felt the edge, searching for the indentation in the wall she had used as a foothold. With the cylindrical object safely tucked into an inner pocket of her tunic, she pushed herself up, feeling the pain in every fiber of her body. The effort was almost unbearable, but the image of her grandchildren, fragile and dependent, was a fire in her chest. Finally, with a muffled groan, she managed to get her body through the hole, falling gently back into the main corridor. The air there was cleaner, though still laden with the palace's smell of dust and antiquity. She crawled to the corner where Lyra and Tomei slept. Her fingers, now more sensitive than ever, felt the grandchildren's foreheads. Lyra was still feverish, but her breathing seemed a little calmer. Tomei coughed softly in her sleep, a sound that broke Ilara's heart, but which she interpreted as a sign that she was still fighting. She sat beside them, pulling out a damp piece of cloth she had found and gently placing it on Lyra's forehead. The touch was soft, full of love and concern. With her grandchildren relatively safe and the object in hand, Ilara turned to the parchments. The morning light was stronger now, but still not enough for her eyes. However, she didn't need sight. She took the cylindrical object from her pocket and placed it on the diary next to the parchments. Her fingers traced the symbols engraved on the metal, comparing them with the raised drawings on the old paper. The symbol of the chain of arches, which Lyra had deciphered, was there, clear and unmistakable. But there was something more. The small hole next to the star on the cylindrical object. She felt the parchments again, searching for a match. Ilara felt a part of the parchment that seemed to have a small elevation, almost a tiny pin, made to fit into something. With her heart pounding, she brought the cylindrical object closer, aligning the hole with the elevation on the parchment. It was a perfect fit. When the two pieces joined, a faint, almost imperceptible click resonated in the palace's silence. And then, a section of the parchment, which had previously seemed like a single sheet, revealed a hidden fold, unfolding to reveal a new set of symbols and an even more detailed map. It was not just a map of the palace, but a map of time, with references to dates and events that seemed to indicate the era in which the treasure had been hidden. True vision, she realized, was revealing itself not only in the soul, but in the connection between the clues, in patience and in unwavering faith. Ilara, with the new map unfolded beneath her fingers, felt a wave of energy course through her tired body. It was not a conventional map, with lines and names, but a tapestry of reliefs and textures, each point a promise, each curve a secret. Her fingers danced over the parchment surface, following the paths that revealed themselves. The small pin of the cylindrical object, still fitted into the parchment, seemed to vibrate, connecting her directly to the ancestral history. The references to dates and events, which were once mere curiosities, now fit together like puzzle pieces, indicating a time of great prosperity and subsequently the moment the treasure had been hidden, not out of greed, but for protection. The map did not lead to a specific room in the palace, but to a broader location, outside its walls, in the ruins of what was once the heart of the village. The tactile description spoke of a dry fountain that wept tears of stone, and of 3 ancient trees that guarded the silence of kings. Ilara could feel the urgency in her chest. Lyra and Tomei, though still sleeping, seemed more restless. Lyra's fever persisted, and Tomei's cough was a constant reminder of the fragility of their lives. She needed to act, and quickly. With the cylindrical object carefully stored and the parchment rolled and tucked into her tunic, Ilara stood up. Every muscle protested, but her determination was stronger than the pain. She approached her grandchildren, caressing Lyra's hair and feeling Tomei's warm forehead. "My little ones, hope is near," she whispered, her voice choked. She knew she couldn't take them on the final search. The path would be treacherous, and the darkness of the abandoned village even more dangerous. She needed to leave them safely, near the light coming from the trapdoor, where she had found them. With a heavy heart but a focused mind, Ilara left the palace, guided only by the tactile memory of the map and by intuition. The morning air was cold and biting, and the silence of the abandoned village was almost palpable, broken only by the rustling of the wind among the ruins. She felt the walls of the collapsed houses, sensing the texture of the stones and rotten wood. Her feet felt the irregularities of the ground, the rubble, the roots of the plants that had taken over everything. She moved cautiously, but with a speed that urgency imposed upon her. Finally, her fingers found a smoother, colder surface. It was the stone of the dry fountain. She followed it, feeling the grooves where water had once flowed. Beside it, there was a cluster of thick, gnarled trunks. The 3 ancient trees. Ilara stopped, her heart pounding in her chest. She was at the location. The map indicated a spot between the tree roots where the earth seemed softer. She knelt, her hands exploring the soil. There was a slight depression, and beneath a layer of dry leaves and earth, her fingers found something hard and cold. It wasn't a rock. It was a smooth stone surface, almost perfectly round, with a small indentation in the center. It was the place. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She took the cylindrical object from her pocket. Her fingers traced the indentation in the stone and the small hole in the object. It was a perfect fit. With trembling hands, she inserted the object. A soft yet resonant click echoed in the village's silence. The round stone began to turn slowly, revealing a dark compartment below. The smell of earth and mold gave way to a sweet, ancient aroma, like aged wood and dried herbs. Ilara reached out, feeling the darkness. Her fingers brushed against something soft, like ancient fabric, and then something heavier with a familiar texture. It was wood, a box, perhaps. She pulled, and with an effort, a heavy, ancient wooden box emerged from the hole. Ilara's heart pounded. The climax of her journey was there in her hands. She couldn't see, but she felt the promise of a future, the redemption of her name, and the salvation of her beloved grandchildren. Ilara, with trembling hands, felt the weight of the ancient wooden box. It was heavy, solid, and the sweet, earthy scent emanating from it seemed to carry the essence of centuries. Her fingers traced the surface, feeling the grooves of the aged wood and the raised carvings that she supposed told a story. There was a metal clasp, rusted but still resistant, which she carefully felt. It wasn't a complex lock, but a simple mechanism, perhaps a latch that time had made stubborn. With a sigh, Ilara applied slight pressure, and with a soft creak, the clasp gave way. Ilara's heart beat like a drum in her chest as she lifted the lid. A gust of ancient air, even sweeter and laden with mystery, escaped from the box. She reached her hands inside, feeling what was there. Her fingers first touched a soft fabric, perhaps ancient velvet or silk, which crumbled slightly to the touch. Beneath it, there was a layer of objects. They weren't just coins, though she felt the round, cold shape of some. There was something more. She pulled out an object. It was a small statuette, cold and smooth, that seemed to have been carved from ivory or a precious stone. Her fingers felt the fine details, the curves of a figure she imagined to be an ancient goddess or queen. There were other pieces, smaller, but equally precious to the touch. Necklaces with beads that looked like pearls or polished stones, rings with intricate reliefs, and yes, coins. Many of them, of different sizes and weights, with the coldness of gold and silver. It was not just a material fortune, but a legacy, a testament to an era of splendor. But what most caught her attention, hidden beneath the treasures and wrapped in a thicker fabric, was a parchment. It was different from the others she had found. This one was more robust, sealed with ancient wax that crumbled under her fingers. As she carefully unfolded it, Ilara felt the texture of an official document. Her fingers traced the lines, feeling the raised letters and symbols. It was a testament, a record, and in it, to her surprise and relief, was the truth. The document not only detailed the existence of the ancestral treasure and the lineage of the kings who had hidden it, but also contained an explicit declaration about her deceased husband's forged debt. It was a confession, signed and sealed by one of the palace's ancient administrators, revealing the cruel plot and her husband's innocence. The debt, in fact, never existed. It was a fraud, as the parchments had already suggested, but now with irrefutable proof. An overwhelming wave of emotion swept over Ilara. Warm tears streamed down her cheeks, mixing with dust and sweat. They were not tears of sadness, but of deep gratitude and relief. Justice for her husband, the redemption of his name, the salvation of her family. Everything was there, in that box, in those pieces of a glorious past, and in that undeniable proof of innocence. With a light heart, but a focused mind, Ilara took some of the heaviest coins and the confession parchment, carefully tucking them into her tunic. The rest of the treasure, she knew, would be safe there for now. She needed to return to Lyra and Tomei. She needed to give them food, medicine, and, above all, the certainty that the darkness had passed. The return to the palace was swifter, driven by an energy that exhaustion could no longer contain. Every step was a promise fulfilled. Upon reaching the corridor where she had left her grandchildren, the sun was already higher, and the light entering through the trapdoor was stronger. Ilara approached, kneeling beside Lyra and Tomei. Lyra was still feverish, but her breathing was softer. Tomei coughed again, but with less intensity. Ilara, with her hands full of coins and her heart overflowing with hope, knew that misery had come to an end. True vision, she realized, was not just the ability to see the world, but to perceive the truth, justice, and hope that blossom even in the deepest darkness. They were saved. Ilara, with her hands full of coins and her heart overflowing with hope, knew that misery had come to an end. She leaned over Lyra and Tomei, her soft fingers touching their still warm foreheads. "My little ones," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Everything will be all right now." The first thing was their health. With the coins in hand, she knew she could seek help in the village, even if it was now uninhabited. There was a small, abandoned pharmacy she had noticed, a place where there might still be herbs and ointments. With a kiss on each of their foreheads, Ilara stood up, urgency in her steps. She moved quickly through the palace, using the tactile map in her mind to guide her. The pharmacy was on one of the side streets, and she felt the dusty shelves, sensing the bottles and jars. She found some dried herbs for fever-reducing teas and an ointment for coughs. She returned to the palace with a new sense of purpose. With the herbs, she lit a small fire with twigs and dry leaves she had collected, using a flint she had found in the iron box. The sweet smell of the tea began to spread, mixing with the palace's musty aroma. Lyra and Tomei, awakened by the smell and warmth, opened their sleepy eyes. Ilara helped them drink the warm tea, and the ointment was gently rubbed on their chests. The relief was almost instantaneous. Lyra's fever began to subside, and Tomei's cough, though still present, seemed less severe. They ate the little dry bread that remained, but now with the promise of more. In the days that followed, Ilara not only cared for her grandchildren, but also prepared for the next step. With the confession parchment in hand, she knew she needed to confront those who had defamed her husband and driven her from her home. She sought out the few residents who still lived near the village, those who, out of fear or indifference, had witnessed her misfortune. With a firm voice, yet full of dignity, Ilara presented the document. The words, though she could not read them, were clear to others. The truth came to light, shocking and shaming everyone. The debt was a fraud, her husband innocent. Her beloved's name was cleared and the injustice undone. With justice restored and the ancestral treasure at her disposal, Ilara began to transform the palace. She did not seek luxuries, but safety and comfort for Lyra and Tomei. She hired artisans from the neighboring village, offering work and fair pay. The ruins began to come to life. Walls were repaired, roofs mended, and dust and rubble gave way to a welcoming home. The palace, which was once a symbol of curse, became a beacon of hope. Prosperity was not restricted to the palace walls. Ilara used part of the treasure to revitalize the abandoned village. She financed the reconstruction of houses, the restoration of the dry fountain that now gushed fresh water, and the creation of a market where residents could sell their products. Families who had left began to return, attracted by the promise of a new beginning. The village flourished, reborn from the ashes, and Ilara, the blind widow, became its benefactress, its guide. Lyra and Tomei, now healthy and full of life, ran through the restored palace gardens, their laughter echoing through the corridors that were once silent. Ilara, sitting on a stone bench in the sun, felt the warmth on her face and the gentle wind in her hair. She couldn't see them, but she could hear them, could feel the joy radiating from them. Blindness was no longer a barrier, but a lens through which she saw the world with a different clarity. She had found the treasure, not just in gold and jewels, but in the strength of love, the resilience of the human spirit, and the ability to transform darkness into light. True vision, she knew, resided in the soul, in intuition, and in the unwavering faith that, even in the deepest darkness, hope can always blossom. And so Ilara, with her grandchildren and a renewed village, lived her days, a testament that a pure heart can change destiny. The years unfolded with hope and work. The palace, once a somber echo, pulsed with life. Corridors that Ilara had mapped resonated with the laughter of Lyra and Tomei, strong and curious. Their steps guided their grandmother, describing the colors of the gardens, the sun in the windows, and the joyful movement of the residents. Lyra, intelligent, became Ilara's right hand in administration. She read documents, interpreted maps, organized resources, consulting her grandmother, whose wisdom was more valuable than any sight. Tomei, with a gentle spirit, cared for the younger and older residents, spreading compassion. She sang songs about her grandmother, the palace, and the treasure, transforming the legend into a living legacy. The village, reborn hope, flourished under Ilara, who, blind, saw the needs of the people. The dry fountain gushed crystal clear water, irrigating fertile fields. The vibrant market was the heart of the community, where products and stories were shared. Rebuilt houses sheltered happy families. Children played freely, without fear. Ilara spent her days on her stone bench in the garden, feeling the sun and the scent of flowers. She heard the village's buzz, her grandchildren's voices, the birds' song, each sound a melody of gratitude. Blindness, once an affliction, transformed into a gift, allowing her to perceive the essence of things, the goodness in hearts and invisible beauty. She remembered the darkness, the hunger, and the despair. The somber memory brought no bitterness, only the certainty that faith and persistence move mountains. True vision, she knew, was not seeing with the eyes, but feeling with the soul, believing in the impossible, finding light even in loss. One day, Lyra approached, holding the cylindrical object, the key to the treasure. "Grandma," the girl said, "this object brought us so much, but the true treasure was your courage." Ilara smiled. "The true treasure, my granddaughter, is the love we share, the community we built, and the hope that never abandoned us." Tomei joined them, her soft hand in her grandmother's. "And justice for Grandma," she added, her eyes shining. Her name was cleared, and everyone knows the truth. Ilara nodded, feeling deep peace. The forged debt, the defamation, all overcome. Her husband's legacy was honored, his memory lived on in the prosperity they built. The palace, a symbol of resilience, and the village, a beacon of renewal, were living proof that true vision resides in the soul, in intuition, and in the purity of heart. Ilara, with her grandchildren by her side, felt the gentle wind on her face, a breath of a bright and eternal future, where darkness would never again prevail over the inextinguishable flame of hope.